unfortunately the Polo has killed itself again. We've taken the engine out of the red Polo again. It's the 1.2 litre 3-cylinder BMD engine. The main issue was erratic power under throttle and then a lot of smoke coming out the back of it. I suspect heavily that it's piston rings. So what we're going to do today is strip the engine right down. We are then going to replace spark plugs, front and rear main seals, full set of piston rings, head gasket, valve stem seals, and then obviously the oil filter and coolant afterwards. This should hopefully fix most things in the engine and just refresh it up a little bit. So first off, we're taking the serpentine or auxiliary belt off. To do this, we have to release the tension off the belt, which requires a T50 Torx bit, and you just place it in and pull back. That then releases all tension on the belt. You should then be able to unwind it from all the pulleys, and as you release off, you can then pull that out and remove the rest of the belt. Next up, we've got to try and take the pulley off. These are usually done on pretty tight, so I'm going to use the impact on this. That requires an 18mm 12-point socket. Damn it. So make sure it's seated fully first. Luckily that came off fairly easily. And there we go, that's off. Right here is the front main seal, which we'll be replacing at some point as well. This goes over the timing chain cover and around the crank pulley. So next up, we are taking the water pump pulley off because that slightly obscures the timing cover. Normally these are 6mm Allens, but the ones on here were stripped off when I did the last job. So like then, I'm having to use a T40 Torx, which will just grip into the bolt a little bit and should zip them off. As you can see, we now have full access all the way around the timing cover. Next job we've got to do is start removing all the timing cover bolts. There is a number of 5mm Allens all the way around, mixed with an M10 triple square bit, a couple of those, and I think these are 16mm bolts that are part of the engine mount section of it. So we're going to start off with all of the Allens. So for this one, it's stripped out quite easily. So I've got an extension of a T40 Torx, hammered it in, and then used the hand ratchet to break it free. That just enables me to remove it without stripping it out further. now most of the bolts are out, we're going to put them into a bag to keep them safe. We're now going to take out the level sensor and the dipstick, which again requires the 5mm. Use the ratchet on this one as the impact won't quite fit. So now that's out of the way, that then gives us access to this one that's hidden away just behind. We also have to remove these bolts here and the triple squares, so we'll do the triple squares first. They are an M10 triple square, which, lovely. With these you've got to ensure that they are perfectly seated. Sometimes you give them a tap with a hammer, because these can be quite easy to strip out if they're not fully seated. Now we're going to take these out, which we're going to use the ratchet for. Just to check, yes, they are 16mm. So now they're broken loose. And use the impact just to zip them out the rest of the way. So now all the bolts up here are taken off, but we have a few that hold the sump to the timing cover. So we're going to have to spin the engine over and remove the sump, which then will allow us to take off the timing cover and have a quick look underneath as well. So to remove the sump we have quite a few, once again 5mm. By the looks of it, previously someone has lost one and replaced it with a little 10mm bolt, and they also haven't fully seated one of them. So we're just going to zip all of those out and then we'll be able to get the front timing cover and everything off. So we've now got all of the bolts out, so the next job to do is trying to lift the sump off. They are often quite well stuck on, so what I like to start off with, one of these like putty knives, you just push it into gaps and try and cut any sealant that was used when fitting, and it also doesn't damage the sump by trying to split it apart too hard at first. Once it's been released off, you can then pull the rest of the sump off. So in here, this is the oil pump. It's driven by a chain that is part of the timing chain system, which I'll be getting off in a second. It sucks oil up through the pickup pumps it up and then sends it through loads of galleries through the engine to all of the places to reduce wear. So now we're going to try and take the timing cover off. It's pretty much a very similar way from the sump. Using the putty knife, we try and find some gaps along, work this up and through it, giving a little wiggle as you go. Some bits are a little more stuck on than others. There we go. That's what I'm going to do for this bit, just to give us a little bit of help. A little pry bar. And you can wedge it slightly in between two solid metal pieces. I'm going to put the tray in there because this will probably chuck off a lot of oil. One thing I have forgotten to do though, we do have this bolt here which holds the alternator on, that also goes through the timing cover. So the first thing we're going to have to do again is move the pulley out of the way and then remove this, which looks like a 13mm bolt, which then means we can try and get the timing cover off. So we're going to try and do that now. So while trying to move the tensioner out of the way, the piece actually snapped off the side of it, which is quite surprising. That does make it a bit more tricky, but the way I've managed to just about get around that is by using a 13mm spanner up underneath, and I've broken it loose. And what I'm going to do is, because that's going to just about catch on here, I'm going to use a bar just to push this slightly out of the way and hopefully give me enough room to actually get the bolt out and to the timing cover. Right, if you pause there. What I've decided to do as well to give me a bit more space is I'm using an E14, which is basically an external Torx bit, which will then loosen off the entire tensioner unit and hopefully give me enough room just to move it out of the way. I should be able to get through to that. Once that's broken loose, on the other side there is a 17mm nut on the end of the bolt. So now that's given me, as you can see, quite a lot of movement out of the way. I can now get to that with my 13mm ratchet spanner. I'm going to use the gun instead, just because it's a little bit quicker. That thing fully comes out. We're then going to loosen off the top alternator bolt as well, so then we can swing the alternator out of the way, which may require the bar again. There we go. And as you can see, nothing's connecting the timing cover. So the whole timing cover now comes off. In here, you can see we're upside down, but this is the camshaft sprocket. This is what actually drives the camshaft, which opens and closes the valves. Up here is what comes from the crankshaft. This also has a oil pump chain, as I said before, but also a balance shaft gear as well. And what balance shaft does is, as the engine's rotating, it has forces, often unequal. So this balance shaft that runs across the top will basically create opposing vibrations, which will then cancel those out and make the engine run a little bit smoother and hopefully not wreck itself. We're going to take the oil pump drive cover off, and that's just one 5mm Allen bit. Which pops straight out of there. And then what we have on this side is a little clip, which hopefully wiggle out like that. And then the cover is slightly wedged, unfortunately. That's it. So now, if we wiggle it around that way, it comes off, which then shows us the drive. What we're going to do now is remove the tension off the oil pump chain, and the whole sprocket should come off. We've got the tension off that spring out. That then leaves us with hopefully the ability to go. So to take the chain off, we're going to have to take off the little sprocket for the oil pump, and this is a 13mm bolt once again. And have the sprocket, we can take the chain and the crank sprocket off as well. So gives us access to the actual timing chain sprocket. For this, we are going to give it a clean up, and we're going to put some markings on both points so we know where they line up again. What I did is before we timed it up correctly, so this should all be with a new timing chain and everything, so this all should be fine. It was running normally beforehand as well, so we'll just mark up how it is and leave it like that. So we're going to use a brake clean, which is really good for going through oil and grease and everything. And we're just going to give some areas a spray and then use a chalk paint pen just to put some little marks on there. So for this, because obviously we want to make sure that we get the chain the right way up so the timing's in correct places, we're going to do a mark here, and then on this one we're going to do another mark just next to it, so you've got 2 points of reference. Down here we're going to do just one mark there onto here, so we know that this one will be for the crank pulley, and this one with the 2 marks will be up for the camshaft pulley. It also gives us the direction of which way forward or backward the chain will face. Now the next step is to release the tension off the chain, and for this we need to obviously remove our tensioner. This will require once again the 5mm Allen bit, and what we'll do is we'll start loosening them all off. And then from there we will slowly take them, or fire them all out, that works too, into the oil. Fabulous. And the way this works is there are little oil galleries that run through the back, which is why there's ports through here. That will then push onto here when the engine's running and there's pressure running through the engine. And this will then rest on the back of the guide, which timing chains have, and we'll keep the tension on this side. This orange side is static, it doesn't move at all, that's constant how it is. So now we've got that tensioner off, we're going to take off this timing guide. All they are little dowels, and obviously this side is free floating. So we will pull away with some of the chain and try and slide the guide off, which can be a bit awkward to do, so it may take a bit of wiggling. There we have it. From there we should hopefully have enough room. Now, we're going to have to put a socket on here and just turn it forward a tiny bit, and that should release the tension off this side, allowing us to get off this other guide as well. That looks like a 16mm. Which it is. As you can see, as soon as we do that, we've got tension on this side, and it releases off the tension on this side, which then should give us the freedom to release the guide off the 3 dowels on this side. There we go. At this point the chain should be fairly loose, and we should be able to there we go. So we'll take the bottom off because that's much easier to come off than the top. As you can see here, we've got a little, what they call a woodruff key, a little notch into here, which then fits into a little external dowel on the bottom here. That keeps the engine in time so this cog doesn't slip, putting the cam and crank out of time. So next we're going to start taking spark plugs out. We are using the 10mm deep one, and on extension because we've got to go through these core pack holder rings. So at first, with the ratchet, and then we can swap to the gun just to get it out a bit quicker. They smell very oily and very fueling. As you can see, the electrodes, they don't look too worn, but they are heavily covered in oil, which should be consistent with the piston ring failure. Next up, we are going to take off the valve cover, or the cam cover as they call it. This is covered by, I think it's about 10 or 12 10mm bolts. If I remember rightly, this one also is the cam hold down, so you want to do it in a certain frequency. or order, as I should say. So we're going to start from the outsides and work our way in. But before we do that, we're going to take off the cam position sensor, as that does slightly obscure a couple of the bolts. As with the rest of the engine, it's a 5mm Allen. I always try and put the bolts back just so they don't get lost. Like my mental state. And then again, I don't want to use the impact to break them loose, so I'm going to use the hand ratchet. I'm going to start right from the outside. Just do a couple of little ratchets. I'm going to use, if I can find where I put it, I'm going to use the extension on this particular one because it is stuck right up. A little bit more awkward to get to with the thickness of the ratchet. Take that cap off, because we do have another bolt just inside the oil filler. I'm not going to be able to do with this. So to reach one in here, I've had to get a very small 10mm, which will just about fit in. I may as well use this for the rest of it. The reason you do it in a certain order is to prevent any excess stress on the camshaft, because you have the springs pushing up against any lobes that may be pressing down on valves. So if you were to fully remove both the sides and leave the middle fully torqued down, it could potentially risk snapping the camshaft and could also damage the cam cover. So now they're all mostly broken loose. You can now start removing them more. Just to speed it up a bit. I'm going to get another bag so we can try and keep all of these together. There we go. Right, now they're fairly stuck down well. So one of the options is we'll try the scraper again, see if we can pry anything in. These are usually quite well stuck together, so you may not get anywhere where you can actually put it in. So the other option, you get the pry bar, you pick a non-structural piece of the actual valve cover, and you can try and wedge it under and just give it a little whack up there, and not fall over. There we go, starting to break loose slightly, so we don't want to use that on the actual mating surfaces. So we'll use our scraper again, cut any gasket that we can this side, and then work our way around. And it comes off. As I said, these little journals here are what press down on the camshaft main lobes here and hold it down and secure inside the cylinder head. We'll put this off to one side. And we'll do is we'll remove our camshaft. So the next job we have to do is to remove the actual cylinder head. What this does is seals off the combustion chamber inside and also houses the valves and the rocker arms, which open and close the valves in timing with the camshaft. So to get the cylinder head off, we are going to have to remove part of the coolant piping system. These are, once again, I think 5mm Allen. Yep. Alright, that one came out quite nicely. No, that one's a bit old and rusted and stripped. Two. Number three. Alright, to get that one out, we'll try the Torx triple then. Ready? So I'm using an enlarged T40 bit because the T30 and the 5mm Allen I've just stripped it out because by the looks of it all the rest of the bolts were much shinier than this one. This one's quite a rusted one. So we're going to hammer this in and then use that to try and remove it out. Alright, so once that's in, we should then, if we're gentle, to remove that one out as well. That should then free that off. There's a rubber gasket in there which we want to salvage as much as possible of. So we'll paste that back in. But that then does completely clear the cylinder head, ready for removal. For this we're going to use an M12, an extended one, just so we can get into some of the better reaches. I'm going to use this on the ratchet because I don't want to use an impact on breaking them loose. I'm going to do a similar sort of sequence to what we did with the cam cover. I'm going to start from the outside, break them off a little bit and then move in before we start removing them out fully. the impact's run out of battery. I'm going to continue on with the ratchet. So now we've got all the head bolts released, we are going to one by one try and remove them, but this one seemed to be stuck in the head. We'll leave that one for a moment. Cylinder head, luckily, is already quite loose, so just pull it off. And there is quite a bit of carbon build-up and oil and fuel. If we look underneath, you can see as well on both the intake and exhaust valves there's a fair bit of build-up, but it's not too bad around the outsides. So we are going to replace the head gasket, even though this one's only a few months old, because realistically once you start breaking gaskets and stuff apart you should really replace them, and this is one of the most key gaskets inside the entire engine, so we're going to replace that one as precaution. What we're going to do next, in order to get the pistons out, we have to spin the engine over, take off the upper sump, which is what timing chain engine have. It's to kind of keep the rotating assembly of the crankshaft and everything out of the oil, and so the oil pump gear and drive and everything gets decent access to the oil reservoir essentially. As you can see, out of cylinder 2, there's a bit of oil coming out, which you would expect a little bit of oil running past the piston rings because there are slight gaps in them, but that is quite a bit. So we're going to make sure we empty out as much as possible. And then put that muffler. So we rotate it all the way over, and then slide the pin back through, hold it in place. For this we're going to first off have to take the oil pump out, and then also mark up our balance shaft so when we fit it together they are conjoined in the correct place, so the balance shaft is in the right location to balance out the crankshaft. So for these, as far as I'm aware, again, they are 13mm. So to remove the oil pump, it's 3 13mm bolts around the outside. Oil pump comes off, and we're going to sit off to the side with the cylinder head. So the easiest way to do with the balance shaft is actually, there are 2 little timing marks here and here, little like circles cut into the actual teeth area. That basically means when you put it together, those two teeth should essentially be meshed together, and that will give you the perfect balance shaft to crankshaft positioning. So that will not require me having to take that off. We'll clean up and mark it and everything like that. So now we're going to take the upper sump off, which again has a large number of 13mm bolts, and we're going to take all those off in roughly a similar sort of pattern to above, in order to not warp it or crack anything. No, I was wrong. So it turns out the external ones are 13mm, but the internal ones are 14mm. So we are going to start off here and then move to here. Now we switch over onto our 14, because these two in here are also 14mm. Because these central spine of them are the ones that carry most of the load from the crank rotation. And then we're also going to do So now we've got all of the bolts released, we're going to remove them all. Now in theory the bottom end of this should be removable, so we've got to work out the best way of separating it. Which again looks like pry bar just up on under here. Two non-structural pieces of the block and the bottom end, which then breaks that apart. Should now hopefully split them apart. This piece also houses the main bearings here. This is a main cap all in one unit, and by the looks of it they are in still fairly good condition. They've got mostly silver on them and they're not too oiled up. So here we have the crankshaft with our connecting rods fitted, 1, 2 and 3 being a 3-cylinder. So what we're going to do now is release all of these off, and then drop the con rods and pistons at the bottom. We're probably going to angle it slightly so it doesn't just fly straight out. So now we've released off all the main cap bearing, main cap bolts at the end of the connecting rods. What we're going to do from now, fully unseat them, and then what you can do, twist them in a tiny bit, just give them a quick, which will then split them apart. You want to make sure that you keep the connecting rod and connecting rod cap the same way around, so you don't mess them up, and because they can clamp wrong if that happens. So what we're going to do now is grab the cap. Bearing has come off with it, so I'll take the bearing and temporarily reseat it like that. We then seat that off to one side. We can then start pushing piston out. I'm going to put my hand underneath to catch it as it falls. There we go. What I'm going to do is just temporarily refit both sides together. This is for cylinder 1. Comes out that way. So we've got the cutout will face towards the cooling system. So now this is up to the last cylinder. We're taking the final piston out. The bottom. And once again fitting the end caps on. We're also going to remove the crankshaft out of the engine block. Which is a little bit stuck with the main seal on. So if I remove the main seal, hopefully we should get, there we go. So what we had fall at the bottom was one of our thrust bearings. This basically removes all the force from when the crank shakes forward and backward from when you press and depress the clutch. That's all these are fitted. Fitted one on each side of this journal here. So I will remove those so they don't get lost. But otherwise, the white metal's unscored, they look absolutely fine still to be reused. This is the main seal here. Sits around the crankshaft, stops the oil coming out from these feed holes here outside of the car. And we will be replacing that one as well. This is the one up against the gearbox side. So that is basically the engine fully disassembled. We are left purely just the block now. I'm going to do some separate videos on the components that we took apart, what their uses are, what they do basically. If you want to watch those, I'll put a link in the description down below. Next up, I'm going to check around the engine, see if there are any signs of the wear from the piston rings on the bores, which I'll just explain in a second. And then once that's happened, we'll be getting cleaning it all up and getting it back together. So inside the block, this is the combustion chamber area, the cylinder. What we're checking for in here is scoring and lipping. And lipping is basically where the piston rings will wear up and down inside the stroke length, and then right at the top where the piston rings don't quite touch, there might be a little lip where it's not quite so worn. In this engine there is virtually no wear at all. I can't feel any sort of lipping. And inside the actual block, can't really see too well. So what I'm going to do is do a little bit of brake clean. Give one of the cylinders a quick blast out. Into the other ones over here. Inside, it's not too bad. There's a small bit of scoring in the cross hatching that's usually in there to help oil stick to the sides to lubricate the piston rings. Is fairly worn away, but in this sort of engine it's not the kind of biggest deal in the world. If we had a bit more time on it, we would get it rehoned, which they would then put those score marks back in the cross hatchings. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you watch the rest of the videos.